I'd be extremely grateful because now we want to move on to the last session of the day. We've got a lot to get through. We're going to be focusing on space power and emerging technology, leading on from those really insightful comments that we had from General Saltzman just a little earlier. We're going to look at the tremendous opportunities that the space domain offers, but also look at the potential threats and challenges as well. I would now really like to welcome this really great panel of speakers that we have lined up to talk more about the challenges and opportunities that we face. So please do welcome our panellists. We have Professor Anu Ojha from the UK Space Agency. Also, we have Nick Patrick, Dr. Nick Patrick, who's flown on the US Space Shuttle with NASA. Also, many of you will know the first commander of the UK Space Command, Air Vice Marshal Paul Godfrey, plus Group Captain Anita Burney, who we saw last year. Great to see you back here again, Anita, Director of MDA UK, and also Jonathan Smith, Vice President of Capability for Leonardo. Jonathan, thank you and welcome. So I would now like to hand over to our first speaker of the day, Professor Anu Ojha from the UK Space Agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure and privilege for me to be presenting to you all today on behalf of the United Kingdom Space Agency, and also with my academic hat on. I've retained my professorship at the University of Leicester, and what I want to do is I want to hopefully bridge a gap between what we heard in the final session this morning and contributions from my fellow panellists. To set the scene, very often when I'm asked by members of the public or policymakers, what do you mean by space stuff? For me, the answer is very simple, and it's three categories. Firstly, there's looking out there, which is astronomy. Secondly, there's going out there, which is exploration. But I think of most relevance to the defence audience will be that third category, the satellites whose primary focus is not looking out there, but it's looking back here at planet Earth. This is the world of satellite applications, space for the benefit of life on Earth. Now, I was really interested yesterday in seeing the primacy of concern in the defence arena about climate change. And what I wanted to highlight is that when we're looking at climate change and the 50-plus critical variables that we need to monitor, for more than half of them, the only way we can do it at the resolution and the cadence that we need is by using space-based platforms. Again, from a civil perspective, when we're looking at telecoms capabilities, when we're looking at navigational satellite capabilities, it's fair to say that space capabilities are not just part of our critical national infrastructures, they are part of our critical societal infrastructures. And my final reflection in terms of defence space, again, building on what we heard this morning, I think the events of the last 15 months have shown us, not just with Elon Musk and Starlink capabilities for Ukraine, but also in the commercial sector, the release of imagery by Maxar at the start of the invasion that completely dispelled the Russian narrative that's been put forward. Much more recently, the release by Planet Labs, a commercial company, of imagery around Zaporizhia, showing what was happening around that nuclear reactor. That really brought home to policymakers around the world that defence space capabilities are no longer a nice-to-have, but they are a must-have. And I think from my perspective, it's fair to say that this is the most exciting but also the most challenging time in space since my childhood. So I want to highlight three forcing functions for that I think are of most relevance to a defence space audience. The first one is the role of industry, the second one is the role of computation, and the third one is the role of new geopolitical partnerships and capabilities in a changing world. On the industry side, we're seeing a revolution in the relationship between commercial space and government with the establishment of what we call a new space ecosystem that I know my panellists will be talking about. Secondly, in terms of computation, high-performance computing capability, machine learning, artificial intelligence, quantum computation capabilities. Now, these are separate fields that are interlinked to some degree. We must make sure we don't conflate them, but we need to be working proactively and in a future-proof way to look at how they're affecting our systems. And finally, in terms of new geopolitical partnerships, we're now seeing as part of this new 21st century multipolar world with a shift of influence and prosperity eastwards and southwards, the establishment of new space agencies. I'm delighted that we've got representatives from Australia here. We've seen the establishment of the Australian space agencies, but there are others that, again, in terms of our civil and our dual use capabilities, we should look at working with. What are the opportunities there? But in terms of two key priority areas for civ, defence, space synergies working together, two areas I want to highlight. The first of those areas is looking at the research and innovation capabilities that we have. The General was talking earlier about space situational awareness and about space domain awareness, but also when we are looking at the world-class expertise, for example, in the United Kingdom in the academic sector, we have in Earth observation capabilities, in imagery from space, you can start to see those linkages through to defence space requirements. The challenge is, how do we bridge the research and innovation community with the defence space community? Now, there are silos of excellence already, but to meet the challenges that we need to for defence requirements, we need to up by an order of magnitude the scale of our endeavours and the pace at which we're working. And that means both communities need to proactively, perhaps, contributing to recalibrating the prisms through which one community will see another. We heard a lot of discussions, my second point, about the promise of mega constellations. In terms of the sort of civil space perspective, what mega constellations enable us to do, so having hundreds of thousands of low Earth orbit network satellites, is effectively connecting the 3 billion unconnected people on this planet. And why that is so important is that if we're looking at future prosperity of individual nations, which is a contributor to global stability, geopolitically, it's down to food supply, energy supply, skills supply, and data. And so when we're looking at OneWeb, when we're looking at Starlink, when we're looking at Kuiper, there are tremendous rideshare opportunities that lend themselves to dual-use thinking. I suppose the challenges that we need to face, there are twofold. One is to make sure that we are proactive about network security and vulnerabilities when we have critical reliance there. But the second area we need to think about is the whole issue of how crowded that environment is in low Earth orbit. As of today, there are about 7,000 active satellites, of which 44,300 of which are Starlink. By the end of this decade, in terms of active satellites, there'll be 17,000 plus. So traffic management is absolutely key, let alone the challenges of space debris, which, if we don't do something proactively about it, monitoring it, regulating it to some degree, we run the danger within 10 or 15 years, perhaps, of making that entire space unusable. We need to be working together as communities to address this. We do not want to face the analogous plastics in the ocean area. The other challenge I would like to pose in terms of mega constellations is it is absolutely fantastic, the possibilities they give us. But I think we need to be thinking, whether it is the Chinese Guowan constellation of 13,000 that's being planned, whether it's the Iris² constellation or capability that's been planned by the European Union, whether or not it's Starlink or Starshield, what are the economic, the societal, the political, the defence implications of having a single source provider that is putting your infrastructure up there, that is offering the data processing, and that is offering perhaps that secure connectivity? I leave that as a question to be addressed. And then my final thoughts before I conclude are on the role of China. Now, I know that that Paul Godfrey is going to be talking about that in his presentation. I've had a lot of experience with the Chinese space program between 2014 and the start of the pandemic. The only thing I will say is that China has set as a national goal, being the world leader in space activities by that magic year, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Republic, 2049. And from my perspective, which I know that Paul will go into the details much more, they are potentially on track to meet that. And they're using their space capabilities for massive geopolitical platforming, both globally and to a national audience. I'm down to my last 2 minutes, but I want to finish on a more sort of uplifting note that hopefully will bring everything together. we have an audience of space people and of Air Force personnel. And what struck me personally is just how audacious humanity has been in space. Because when we think of the time gap between the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, 69 years almost to the day afterwards, the last human mission of the Apollo program going to the moon, Apollo 17, sent its crew in December 1972 on a voyage 1,000 times further than the distance to the International Space Station. And on their way out, Jack Schmitt, the geologist on the crew, took one of the most famous images that's ever been taken. I think you're all familiar with it, the blue marble image of planet Earth taken from 28,000 kilometers going out to the moon. And that transformed the environmental movement's perspectives of the Earth. It transformed my perspective as a 4-year-old watching it. What's exciting me about the future is that next year we will see the first human return to the moon in more than half a century with the Artemis 2 mission, in which 3 NASA astronauts and 1 Canadian Space Agency astronaut are going to undertake that human voyage to return to the moon. When they go, they'll be taking all of us and all of society with them vicariously, and they will share with us their 21st century blue marble moments. And what it reminds us, those images, is just how very special our planet is. It is unique in the solar system. We might find life elsewhere. In my academic work, we're looking for traces of past life on Mars, but Earth is different, because for billions of years on Earth, life has thrived. It's changed our atmosphere. It's changed our geology. It's changed our oceans. You could detect this from interstellar distances. What we've learned, most importantly from our space exploration endeavors, is how very special our home planet is. And if we're to protect that environment from if we're to protect planet Earth from an environmental point of view, then space capabilities are no longer a nice to have, they're a must have. But as importantly to me, if we are to protect and defend societally the values that we hold dear, then our defence space capabilities are also no longer a nice to have, they are a must have. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a real privilege talking to you.
And what a great way to set up the presentation that we're going to have now from Dr. Nick Patrick, who has had that view of Earth from space because he's flown on the US Space Shuttle with NASA and has logged 308 hours in space. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you. Air Chief Marshal, Air and Space Chiefs, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, just. It's a real privilege to speak to you today. I normally speak to folks about the experience of flying in space, what it's like to see the Earth from 250 miles up. I speak to everybody from kindergartners to graduate students and their parents and to folks in Congress and answer the strangest range of questions you can imagine. This is a very interesting audience for me, probably the smartest audience I've ever spoken to. And it's very reassuring for me as a civilian to see so many people so very concerned about using space as a capability to protect and defend our security. I'll start by saying I was not exactly normal as a child, I don't think. Like many others, I went through the age-appropriate phases of wanting to dig up dinosaurs and even to fly fighter jets. But I absolutely loved maths and physics, and I was a voracious reader of science fiction, which was probably the defining thing about my childhood, especially technical science fiction by the likes of Arthur Clarke and Larry Niven, who wrote the Ringworld books. I also wanted to sail around the world after I read the account of one of my heroes, Robin Knox Johnston, about his solo around-the-world non-stop voyage. At university, I finally found out what was wrong with me, and they had a word for it. I was an engineer. And the other great thing that happened at university was I got my start in the world of aerospace operations with the RAF's Cambridge University Air Squadron, a wonderful gift that I hope I have put to good use. I'll let you be the judge. Over the 12 years after I left Cambridge, I moved to the States to pursue a career in aerospace engineering. I went to graduate school, and I worked for a few years, one of the wonderful companies up there under the list of sponsors. And after 12 years, I found myself a newly minted mission specialist at NASA, surrounded by like-minded people, all of whom were doing what I wanted to do, which was working to build the science fiction future that they'd read about as children. After 8 years training as an astronaut, a period that was lengthened considerably by the tragic loss of the Columbia spacecraft over Texas, I flew in 2006 on STS-116, a mission to build the International Space Station. Between flights, though, I was at Capcom in mission control for mission STS-124, an international mission that took the Japanese Kibo module up to the space station and attached it. And one of the defining moments of my life, one of the things I'll always remember, is sitting in mission control next to the flight director, and up on the screen in front of us, we monitored everything by video while we were talking to the crew, was an image of the Kibo module being moved on the end of the space station's robot arm, the Canadarm2, while astronauts were outside conducting a spacewalk. And it was at that moment that I realized, I had to pinch myself, I realized I was actually living the science fiction future I had imagined as a child, although I was sitting in mission control. And that's a small detail. A few years later, I flew my second flight on STS-130 and conducted 3 spacewalks, which I normally talk a lot about, and I'll save one anecdote for the end of this talk. After 14 years at NASA, I was still hungry to help build that science fiction future, and probably hungry to live in a less humid place than Houston. So I took a job in the Seattle, Washington area, working for one of those new space companies you've heard about, Blue Origin. And it's primarily my experience at that company that I want to talk about today, and what I think it informs us about the nature of the newer entrance into the commercial space world. At the company, I started the Human-Centered Design Group and eventually became also a launch director for the suborbital human spaceflight program we called New Shepard. Now, I'm no longer with NASA and I'm no longer with Blue Origin, so any opinions you hear from me today are mine and mine alone. I know it's obvious to everybody in this room that space, the high ground above the high ground, is vital to our security and our economic interests. But how do new space companies plan to add to the existing base of well-established and very capable contractors in order to help us reduce costs, increase reliability and safety, and increase the flexibility and availability of launch services? Let's start by looking at their methods. When NASA was necessarily very conservative in its approach, new space is anything but. They employ an unusually high degree of vertical integration. When I started at Blue Origin, there were 150 people, and I could not believe that this small company was building a LOX hydrogen rocket engine, the booster that it would be strapped to, a capsule that would carry humans, and the ground support infrastructure to launch all of it. 150 people. They emphasize manufacturing technologies, particularly things like additive manufacturing. There's a company now that is trying to build, through additive manufacturing, a complete rocket motor. And the ultimate goal of some companies is to 3D print an entire launch vehicle. And I think those goals are actually quite realistic and not very far off. Most importantly, new space companies have a very high tolerance for failure. Think back to the days of the Apollo program. Failure was not an option. But these days, it's seen as an essential part of the path to success. And in fact, it's now almost a rite of passage for a launch company to blow something up either on the launch pad or just a little bit above it. And the people involved will cheer their partial success rather than mourning their partial failure. These companies challenge assumptions. Landing gear's heavy? Remove it. Figure out a way to catch the rocket using the launch tower and the launch platform. Use new fuels. We've seen the emergence of methane as a viable rocket fuel to replace the original kerosene-like rocket fuels. And reusability has for a while been the holy grail of spaceflight for several decades. Think back to DCX and to the British HOTOL project. It essentially is the airline model applied to spaceflight. It requires really good guidance, navigation, and control, which is always getting better. It requires, crucially, restartable and throttleable rocket engines. Those are difficult challenges that have now been solved. Downrange landing sites, sometimes not on the land. and lightweight but robust serviceable designs. There's no point in reusing something that isn't robust enough to reuse. At Blue Origin, we designed and built a vertical landing system for suborbital human spaceflight, which is only a part of the space puzzle, obviously. And in 2015, we were the first company to launch and recover a human-rated spacecraft, and get it all the way to space and recover it safely. And we reused it shortly afterwards. And half a decade later, we were flying, paying passengers on this, including rather famously William Shatner, who flew in 2021, and I had the privilege of a launch director as being in charge of that flight, having an interesting lunch with William Shatner before he flew. Where do we expect these capabilities to take us? Obviously, exponential growth in satellite deployment. There were 2,500 LEO satellites 3 years ago. There are over 10,000 today. That will give us more and better Earth observation, intelligence gathering, and communications capabilities. If I had to start something today to work on a problem that I think is underdeveloped, it would be point-to-point spaceflight. In other words, delivery through space. I won't call it spacelift. That to me implies very large masses, the way you could get with airlift or using ocean-based assets. But the idea of point-to-point delivery is it's a suborbital spaceflight that will take you anywhere on the planet in about 50 minutes. It's suborbital, but the technology, in fact, has a lot more in common with orbital spaceflight. It does require some technology development. Two of the big challenges are it is not a subtle form of delivery. In order to get anything intact to anywhere else on the planet, that payload must arrive after its entry shockwave. So it won't be subtle. It's going to be very, very hard to make it sustainable. And it will need a very good history of safe and successful use before it's anywhere near ready for people. But these are fascinating and exciting challenges. I'm optimistic about these challenges because at places like SpaceX and Blue Origin, you're surrounded by people who share these science fiction-inspired dreams, as you would be anywhere else in the launch industry. The leadership is famous for having grand ambitions, colonize Mars, or move industry off the planet for the benefit of Earth. But they're also quite aware of the other capabilities, both civilian and military, that are enabled by the technologies they develop. The workforce is young, creative, and very enthusiastic. Sustainability is second nature to most of them because of their generation. And the use of simulation and collaborative engineering tools comes naturally. I will say they're often inexperienced in the traditional aerospace sense of the word experienced, and that can be a double-edged sword. But they have a mindset that says that anything is possible. It's a corner of aerospace in which people don't tend to challenge even ambitious goals. They recognize they need to build systems which operate more on the airline model to get the levels of safety, cost, and availability that we all expect. In commercial human spaceflight, there are currently very few rules and regulations, at least in the United States. We're nearing the end of a 2-decade moratorium on the FAA's ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight. So our current approach was to obtain informed consent from our passengers by explaining the risks to them and explaining how we mitigate those risks and characterizing the risks we don't understand well. We also had a very healthy reliance on what I would call peer review, something we've learned may have been missing prior to the recent tragic events in the water column above the wreck of the Titanic. But there are some challenges with the new generation. Discussing defense isn't always popular with them. And they don't always understand, I think, that climate change is an existential threat potentially within their lifetimes. So what questions should we be asking of industry? First and foremost, we need to ask, what do we need from it? And as Heidi said yesterday, we need to ask it what it can provide. Very often, these players know better than we do what their capabilities, real or imagined, are. How can we help it grow in useful directions, beyond providing strategic objectives and carefully targeted research funding? How can we help it be as green as reasonably possible? And I say as reasonably possible here because spaceflight requires lots of energy, delivered at high rates and in high concentrations. But sustainability is almost always customer driven. We need to measure life cycle emissions, by the way, not end-use emissions. And that will help inform the best possible engineering design to give us a sustainable spaceflight. And in the end, how can we keep it safe with oversight, with peer review, and eventually with appropriate regulation? I'll end with a very quick story about spaceflight, about my EVA experiences, because I think the perspective from space is one that's worth sharing with everybody. And I would normally take an hour to do that. But on one of my spacewalks on that second mission in 2010, I was installing a row of handrails on the outside of the node 3, which was the life support node of the space station. And I would go up to a handrail, attach myself to it, pull a new one out of the bag, attach it over here, bolt it on, make sure it was secure, and then move my attachment point over. And in this way, I was able to translate along the station, installing handrails as I went. And at one point, in this very monotonous, glamorous, but monotonous task, I was aware that the silver outside of the space station was suddenly glowing a bright gold. And this was somewhat surprising. Aluminium doesn't glow bright gold. I looked down and I saw the reason. We were flying over the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And it was daytime, and the bright sun was shining on the golden and brown sands and illuminating everything from below. It was a spectacular sight. And it was free of the borders and the politics that we normally associate with the region. It was a great reminder that the Earth is just a beautiful place, worth protecting, and always at its best when seen from above. With that, I'll thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nick. That was fascinating stuff. And now let's, next speaker, Air Vice Marshal Paul Godfrey, who's going to update us on the trajectory of his command.
Air and Space Chiefs, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. There is one golden rule in UK space conferences, and that's not to follow Ojha because he is so inspirational and good at what he does. I now have a second golden rule, which is following an astronaut who is as inspirational as you have been there, Nick, and frankly, Mach 25 is pretty cool as well. So for me, for the next few minutes, I thought I would just highlight some of the technological advances that have been made in the space domain by Russia and China in recent years to give us some idea, and it's been covered over the last couple of days anyway, but the capabilities that we face should they be used against us. And certainly the Soviet Union space program was notable in setting records in space. A deep understanding of the technologies required to further their goals in space. This included launching the very first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, the first animal, a dog, in the same year, and Yuri Gagarin in 1961, just 4 years later. Soviet Union saw the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, in 1963, the first spacewalk in 1965, the first image at the far side of the moon, and the first soft landing on the moon as well. And clearly beaten to a human landing on the moon in 1969. The Soviets moved to a long-term human presence in space and put the first space station, Salyut 1, into orbit in 1971, and then the first modular space station, Mir, in 1986. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, the Soviet space program was disbanded and replaced by the Roscosmos State Corporation for Space Activities. Advances stalled through the early 90s due to severe economic downturn, but were lifted in the early 2000s with the collaboration over the International Space Station. It allowed them to continue their Mir journey and provide human and cargo missions to the ISS from the Soyuz rockets based at their Cosmodrome in Baikonur in Kazakhstan. And since 1957, the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia has launched over 3,000 satellites, over half of which have been military communications or reconnaissance satellites. They have a long history of and experience in space and continue to develop technologies that have the ability to present a significant threat to other users of the space domain. The launch of the Russian direct-to-send anti-satellite missile on the 15th of November in 21 made front-page news. That was a missile launched from Russia, destroying Cosmos 1408 and creating a debris field of over 1,500 trackable pieces of debris, many of which are still orbiting today, almost 2 years later. However, this is not a recent development, and actually the first anti-satellite weapon that Russia developed was in the late 60s, early 70s, a kamikaze on-orbit satellite that was thought to be still operating into the 1980s. So Russia continues today to exploit the technological understanding of space through the investment in space control capabilities. Many of you will have seen the highly classified reporting on Twitter over the last 18 months by Elon Musk, talking about, and it was mentioned this morning, the cyber and jamming being deployed against the Starlink constellation that has been used to reconnect Ukraine to the outside world. And General Raymond, General Saltzman's predecessor, noted in July of 2020, again this was mentioned this morning, that Russia had been observed using a nesting doll satellites, which he said exhibited characteristics of a weapon system as they launched high-speed projectiles into space. And more recently, our joint commercial operations team have noted Lush, a LIMP, believed to be a Russian electronic intelligence satellite, maneuvering very close to one of the Intelsat communications satellites on the geostationary belt. That's just in the last few days. Russia's long history in space has led to a deep understanding of the domain and how best to exploit their own strengths and their competitors' weaknesses through some very specific and cutting-edge technology. China is a relative newcomer to the space domain, but has used every lever as government, as you heard from Brendan yesterday, to ensure that they're a success, and their rapid rise to a formidable space power is a source of national pride. Between the late 50s and 70s, the lack of finance, technological expertise, and repeated political upheavals hampered their emerging space program. However, with the rapidly expanding economy in the 1990s, China began to increase investment, launching both low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit weather satellites and improved communication satellites and Earth observation systems. In November 2000, the Chinese government released their first space white paper, which described the goals in the next decade: to build up an Earth observation system, to set up an independently operated satellite broadcasting system, an independent navigation system, to upgrade the level and capacity of their launch vehicles, to realize human spaceflight, and to develop space science and explore outer space. In the same year, China became only the third country to deploy a positioning, navigation, and timing system, launching 2 regional navigation satellites into geostationary orbit, the Beidou. Almost 20 years later, in June 2020, the 55th and final Beidou satellite was successfully launched, providing global coverage for timing and navigation, an alternative to the US GPS constellation, the Russian GLONASS constellation, and the European Galileo constellation. It's notable that this was completed almost exactly to the date set over 2 decades earlier. Another area where China has significantly enhanced technology is in their human space flight program over a very short period of time. The program was formally approved in September 92 with 3 aspirational steps. Step 1, launch a crewed spaceship with the aim of building up basic capability in human space exploration and space experiments. And the first Chinese taikonaut reached orbit on the 15th of October 2003, only 11 years later. Step 2 was to launch a space laboratory to experiment with space rendezvous, spacecraft docking procedures, and the short-term support of humans in space. This saw several experiments over the years, and a space laboratory was launched in 2016, and in early 2017, Step 2 was completed when a Chinese cargo spacecraft docked with that laboratory for resupply and refuel. And finally, Step 3 was to establish a space station with the aim of supporting humans for longer periods in space. The core module of the Tiangong space station was launched in April of 21, a 22,000 kilogram payload on a Long March 5B rocket. They had definitely increased the capacity of their launch vehicles. 3 months later, the first crewed mission docked with the module, and the crew returned safely to Earth after 3 months in space. Step 3 finished in November of last year. The last element of the space station was assembled, and yet another demonstration of China's ability to stay at the leading edge of technology whilst continually achieving milestones time and time again that have been over 30 years in the making. So why is the commander of UK Space Command talking about China's human space flight program? Well, it's overseen by the China Manned Space Engineering Office, which just happens to sit under China's Central Military Commission Equipment Development Department. As you heard yesterday from Brendan, the US DIA reports that launch sites, control centers, and many of the satellites that China have launched over the last 20 years are overseen by the People's Liberation Army. Taikonauts are members of the PLA Strategic Support Force, launched from PLA bases. The flights are directed by the PLA's Beijing Aerospace Control Center, with telemetry, tracking, and control support from the Xi'an Satellite Control Center located at another PLA base. And when they return to Earth, the Taikonauts land at one of 2 PLA-controlled sites in Inner Mongolia. It is the military aspect of this that points to the potential dual use of much of China's space infrastructure and capability. In 2007, they also demonstrated the ability to shoot down a satellite, destroying a Chinese weather satellite in low Earth orbit. And as well as Brendan mentioned yesterday, in January of last year, the Chinese SJ-21 satellite performed a complex rendezvous and docking procedure with the defunct Beidou satellite and moved it over 3,000 kilometers into a graveyard orbit. Great debris cleanup capability, not so great if they were going to use it against our Skynet communications satellites in the UK. It's also worth noting the PLA Strategic Support Force, the force responsible for the oversight of space, has 2 primary commands, and Brendan again mentioned this yesterday. The Space Systems Department, the other command is the Network Systems Department, responsible for defending and attacking computer networks, electronic warfare, defense and offense, and intercepting signals to collect intelligence. In 2021, Xi Jinping started the latest white paper with the words, "To explore the vast cosmos, develop the space industry, and to build China into a space power is our eternal dream." The plans promise to enhance Earth observation and communications, increase lunar research to prepare for a lunar base in the 2030s, in-orbit servicing and debris cleanup, and notably to strengthen the protection of its space activities. It's again worth highlighting that China have hit almost every single major milestone they have planned for their space capabilities and are likely to have dual civil and military use technologies in everything. This audience knows, and we've heard along this morning, that space is critical to modern life and to modern operations, military operations. Russia and China are both major space powers with significant understanding of the domain and the technology that could increase the threat to our own space capabilities. The key takeaway from this was summed up by General Saltzman this morning. We need to collaborate to ensure that we stay on the leading edge of technology, understand what capabilities are being deployed in space, and how they might be used against us. Working together, we can ensure that all spacefaring nations act responsibly in this increasingly contested, congested, and competed domain. Thank you.
Of MDA UK to talk about the opportunities and challenges facing the commercial space sector.
So I get to follow space rockstar, an astronaut, and now the commander of UK Space Command. So spare a thought for me and for Jonathan as we have got the role of following up after those 3. We're a bit tight on time, but I hope you'll indulge me sharing a few clips and slides to bring space to life, and hopefully make you a little bit jealous about the fact I get to live the space dream every day. So as we consider our current theatres of operation and the different themes that we've covered over the past 2 days, I don't think anyone can be in any doubt that there's a single example where we can gain a war-fighting edge without a space component. And with that in mind, I'm going to share a little bit of time with you, spend a little bit of time with you today to discuss how commercial capabilities can support the defence space agenda as well as the common good. So I started my career in the space industry 3 decades ago, and I continue to be excited and motivated about the course that we are charting forward into the stars. And in parallel, space can and must play a key role in promoting and supporting challenges to life on Earth, in delivering innovation, growth, prosperity, and improved life chances for the global community. In addition to the surge in violent conflicts in the past decade, which have driven 80% of humanitarian needs, we are witnessing the global impacts of climate change and environmental destruction. The past 10 years were the hottest on record. Extreme weather displaces approximately 20 million people every year, and COVID-19 is just one of the latest indicators of the negative impact of human activity on our fragile environment. it's clear that security and stability are two sides of the same coin and the same global ecosystem. Climate change and environmental destruction are the biggest challenges we face on Earth, and in-orbit assets are a key tool for monitoring, mitigating, and responding to these challenges, in addition to supporting our primary role of ensuring that we maintain operational advantage against potential adversaries. So this is why space matters to everyone in this room. Across defence, we require 3 key capabilities to perform our protect and defend role. The means to acquire situational awareness, the means to communicate, and the means to act. And space is the domain that satisfies those enduring needs across 6 key capability areas. Position, navigation and timing to ensure tracking of forces, search and rescue and precision strikes, early warning for force protection and information on missile launches, environmental and weather monitoring for meteorological forecasting and mission planning, secure satellite communications which are essential to enable consultation, command and control, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, which is crucial for situational awareness, planning and decision making, and space domain awareness to identify, analyse, attribute and thus understand and anticipate threats to our assets and our capabilities that reside in or are underpinned by the space environment. Now, we've heard from defence experts over the past 2 days discussing the current and anticipated future operating environment. We all know that over the next few spending review cycles, we will continue to see new threats emerging across land, sea, air, cyber and space. However, the previous threats we've been dealing with haven't gone away, and we increasingly need to find ways to do more, but with less money. We need to find ways to collaborate more across civil, commercial and defence to leverage capabilities wherever possible across those 3 spheres, utilising traditional and non-traditional sources of capability and identifying commercial capabilities that could, if required, be repurposed to support flying and fighting and maintain superiority. So, pulling on that thread, the theme of utilising a core capability for dual-use applications, I'm going to share a few examples in the next few slides of how MDA delivers capabilities for defence and the citizen, noting that I have many colleagues in the room and partners in the room also whose capabilities within their companies are configuring to support our growing dual-use needs. So starting with geointelligence, one person's Earth observation is another person's ISR. At MDA, we designed, launched and operate RadarSat-2, which provides all-weather, day or night, global intelligence about changes on the Earth, on land and at sea. We also lead in maritime domain awareness. In the example in the top right, identifying, tracking and providing near-real actionable alerts to response forces. And this same RadarSat-2 satellite supports the citizen, as illustrated in this clip.
In December 2007, Canada's Earth observation satellite, RadarSat-2, was launched into space. Capable of scanning the Earth at all times, day or night, through any weather conditions, the satellite typically acquires more than 30,000 images a year. These images are used by research centers, private industries, and government departments and agencies across the country and around the world. The information they provide is used for a vast array of applications, from helping monitor fishing activities on our coasts to increasing our agriculture's profitability and sustainability. RadarSat-2 technology can be used to monitor landslide risks along strategic transportation and energy corridors, giving our country the means to better protect critical infrastructures. Because it delivers data in near real time, its images are also used to help coordinate rescue teams on the ground following natural disasters, making RadarSat-2 an essential tool where lives, communities, and the environment are at stake. RadarSat-2 collects critical information on remote or inaccessible areas, helping ships navigate safely through Canadian waters and enabling northern communities to plan safer routes for fishing and hunting expeditions. Space technologies developed for satellites bring new solutions to Earth challenges. The Canadian Space Agency is committed to fostering innovation for the benefit of all Canadians. Canadian Space Agency, thinking outside of the globe.
So, next, let's talk about satellite communications. At MDA, we often get involved in conversations discussing the similarities and differences of what we need for civil, commercial and defence space, about how, at first sight, those needs might seem similar, but that their overarching requirements are fundamentally different. That because our role in defence is all about readiness to deter and respond to threats, that need for timeliness, resilience, robustness, reliability and persistence can drive a different architecture, and that this can make it difficult to achieve sufficient alignment and to achieve synergy across civil, commercial and defence. And I absolutely understand that perspective, but to give you food for thought, I just wanted to share two examples. On the right-hand side, MDA is providing communications payloads for the United States Space Development Agency Space Transport Layer within their resilient network of military satellites. But then, looking on the left-hand side, MDA is the prime contractor. We're building the satellites that Apple will be using for its iPhone SOS service. And I'm certain that everyone here in this room has a grasp of what Apple, one of the most iconic commercial companies in the world, requires from us in terms of mission assurance in the design, production and operation of our system to provide trusted communications to citizens all over the world. Turning to space domain awareness, this is a theme we've been covering quite a lot over the past couple of days, it's clear that we simply don't know enough about what's happening in the space neighbourhood around our satellites, and that we need many more sensors in space and on the ground. And these two examples address the own and access approaches to acquiring SDA capability. Dedicated space-based space domain awareness sensors to allow defence to own assets and task them dynamically according to need, as is the case for the Sapphire satellite, which MDA manufactured and operates on behalf of the Canadian DND. But there are also a range of different emerging commercial models that allow defence to access SDA data commercially rather than having to own the sensors themselves, as in this example, which we're partnered with Thoth to deliver ground-based SDA commercially as a service to observe and track objects of interest in geostationary orbit, where there are increasing irresponsible behaviours towards both defence and commercial assets. Finally, in orbit servicing, it was interesting to hear Dr. Patrick make reference to Canadarm2, which is MDA's robotics system. This is a really interesting area of capability, as there's a growing interest in transitioning from static to dynamic satellite operations and increasing the manoeuvrability of satellites in orbit. Now, this is something that we have historically avoided. We don't like to move satellites. It consumes their finite propellants and it reduces the satellite lifetime. But what if we could move our ISR satellites to better observe areas of interest whenever we wanted? Designing satellites that can be refueled in orbit will revolutionise the trade space for defence. And this is something that MDA demonstrated 15 years ago as part of the DARPA team on the Orbital Express programme. Robotics can also be used to perform active debris removal, to clean up space junk, support space sustainability, and preserve our citizens' access to space that underpins our daily lives, as illustrated in this clip about Astroscale's proposed active debris removal mission. I spoke here on this stage last year about how humans are poor at predicting the future. And as we recall the topics discussed today and yesterday and look back in human history, that's probably not going to change. And in that context, responsiveness and resilience and capability mass will only become more critical. The increasing commercialisation and militarisation of space offers opportunities for synergies and for defence to move from ownership towards collaboration and access. It will be our collective efforts that will shape the future of air and space power, not just for our nations, but for the betterment of humanity as a whole. And I'm confident that, with the visionary leadership from the leaders in this room, and with a commitment to collaboration, we can unlock the full potential of space and emerging technologies. By embracing emerging technologies, commercial systems, and commercial models, we can address the existential challenges facing our species and our planet, as well as deliver against our need to protect and defend. Thank you.
President of Capability and Chief Technical Officer at Leonardo for Future Combat Air.
I'll talk about the graveyard shift, eh? Right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in such an esteemed forum. I have to say that I do feel like a little bit of an imposter, given the company that I'm keeping on the stage right now, as we've just heard from. In 20 years as a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force, I perhaps, thanks largely to the rocket ship that was the F-22 Raptor, got a little closer to space than many, but it's certainly not my area of expertise. What I certainly can offer you, and hopefully bring us in on time, though, is something of an insight into some of the future combat air system emerging technologies that Leonardo UK are working on as part of Team Tempest in the UK and in collaboration with our Italian and Japanese partners on the Global Combat Air Programme. Importantly, I think, for this forum, I will also endeavour to explore some of how the future combat air system will leverage the space domain that we've heard so much about for its benefit, but also critically for the benefit of other users and other assets across all domains. The Global Combat Air Programme is creating a future combat air system that delivers a sixth-generation paradigm shift in combat air lethality, survivability, and mission effectiveness, in spite of the challenges presented in the modern battle space. Now, key to enabling this, for me, is information dominance. To achieve these aims, the future combat air system will incorporate a wide variety of emerging technologies in digitally enabled integrated systems. These emerging technologies and these systems, coupled with a designed-in interoperability, afford FCAS the ability to consume off-board data from any domain, but will also enable the future combat air system to dominate the combat air information domain and thus dramatically enhance its lethality, survivability, and ultimately FCAS's mission effectiveness. Critically though, and unlike former generation combat air assets, FCAS will not just be a consumer of data from other domains. It will be a very significant contributor to the information needs of consumers in other domains. The information advantage that FCAS is uniquely placed to secure will be shared across all domains to increase lethality, survivability, and mission effectiveness of multiple assets in multiple domains. A significant amount of this ability to consume and to offer for consumption vast amounts of cross-domain information will be enabled, at least in part, by leveraging the capabilities within the space domain. By harnessing emerging technologies and exploiting space domain capabilities, amongst others, the future combat air system is designed to be a true citizen of the digital world. Two of the fundamental designed-in integrated systems that will enable key future combat air system capabilities are its integrated sensing and non-kinetic effects system, known colloquially as ISANKI, and its integrated communication system, or ICS. Together, ISANKI and ICS are critical to the ability to deliver information dominance for FCAS, and with it, the lethality, survivability, and mission effectiveness required in the future battle space. A battle space with a rapidly evolving threat picture where hostile state actor threats are increasingly more sophisticated, and as we spoke about with Goddard, harnessing exponential advances and meeting all their milestones in terms of technological capabilities, and where superiority in all of the domains is going to be challenged. So a little bit about what ISANKI and ICS is or are. ISANKI is a complex interconnected mesh of heterogeneous, try saying that, sensing and non-kinetic effecting capabilities that sit across a combat air platform or collections of platforms. In contrast to those traditional individual federated sensor systems, ISANKI is a designed-in, fully integrated network of multifunction radio frequency and electro-optical IR sensors and non-kinetic effecting nodes. Collectively, these nodes use advanced sensor tasking and management algorithms to gather data from across the electromagnetic spectrum and then combine this data using sophisticated fusion algorithms to create accessible information and enable the rapid generation of robust, reliable, and accurate situational awareness. Lest, to butcher John Nesbitt in Megatrends a little bit, we find ourselves drowning in a data lake, but all the time starved of knowledge. The result is going to be a comprehensive situational awareness picture which provides combatants with an enhanced view of the battle space and a real information advantage in combat. But in addition to ISANKI, the Future Combat Air System will also be equipped with a fully integrated communications system comprising of multiple tactical communications and secure data link systems. ICS is the network that enables information to be exchanged rapidly across a Future Combat Air System formation to harness ISANKI fusion capabilities. ICS, critically for this forum, also enables the Future Combat Air System to share information with the wider force mix, contributing information advantage in multi-domain operations. The vast quantity of data gathered across the EMS by an ICS-enabled ISANKI network operating within a Future Combat Air System formation and the sophistication of processing and fusion techniques employed that turn that data into accessible and critically actionable information will far surpass that of currently deployed systems. This is a key component for me of the Future Combat Air System's 6th generation capability. The pilot will be more aware of their surroundings and other entities in the battle space more quickly and at longer ranges. This should result in superior lethality, survivability, and ultimately combat mission effectiveness. A key enabler of the volume or to the volume of data that FCAS is able to gather and handle is very early digitization, whereby analog data harvested from the environment is converted to digital format as early as possible in that sensing chain, utilizing high-performance digital receivers. This is going to enable greater flexibility of operation and higher fidelity compared with legacy systems, improving the quality of situational awareness picture and allowing aircrew to make those decisions based on that information with higher confidence. Additionally, because the ISANKI system is not reliant on any single sensor or any one part of the electromagnetic spectrum or a single platform, it will be much more resilient in the contested and congested modern battle space. So what about the Future Combat Air System and the space domain? Beyond line of sight, satellite communications capability is a key element of the Future Combat Air System's integrated communications system. This is going to allow the Future Combat Air System to access the significant mission enablement available via the space domain. Mission data is a great example of this, and it is clearly a key enabler, especially in this modern era of rapidly evolving threats. FCAS will undoubtedly have an impressive onboard mission data capability, but that's not always going to be enough in the future battle space. By leveraging the space domain, FCAS will be able to access an even greater mission data capability off-board from the platform to update its mission data during mission and/or to provide solutions to those unknowns and those ambiguities that cause so many issues. It will most certainly not all be one-way traffic though, both literally in terms of the data flows, but also figuratively in terms of FCAS being a mission enabler for other assets in other domains. Shamelessly copying one of Anita's themes, one person's Earth observation imagery or data is another person's ISR product. A similar kind of extrapolation exists for Future Combat Air System capabilities. FCAS formations will gather data in such volumes, it is almost inevitable that there will be elements of that that are not relevant to it in terms of increasing its own lethality, survivability, and mission effectiveness. Certainly not in real time. That extra data, along with the data that was relevant to FCAS, will almost certainly be useful to mission completion, lethality, survivability, and/or information advantage of other assets across other domains. A critical element of information advantage, in my opinion, is the ability to counter or defeat disinformation and misinformation. FCAS, often via the space domain, but certainly not exclusively, represents a powerful capability for the asymmetric capture and provision of large amounts of multispectral data, information, and situational awareness. The FCAS will have the ability to access areas of the battle space that are increasingly difficult, risky, and/or impossible, certainly in times of conflict, for traditional assets to access. This will give commanders options that are far lower risk when compared to current means. A combat aircraft is a very different term of an equation for an adversary to have to solve for compared to predictable overhead and strategic wide-body platforms. By networking across the battle space, often through space, into multiple systems in all domains, the Future Combat Air System will enable maximum value extraction from its own inherent flexibility and adaptability for a diverse mix of tasks and roles. This is critical to multi-domain operations. The emerging technologies being developed for the Future Combat Air System, including those in ISANKI and in the ICS, are designed to deliver sixth-generation capability that is lethal, survivable, and extremely mission effective in the challenging context envisioned in the future threat environment. One of the key tenets of achieving that capability is information dominance. However, assuring FCAS information dominance cannot be done on platform and in domain alone. FCAS has to take advantage of the capabilities, data, information, situational awareness that is available from other systems in other domains. Importantly though, the capabilities delivered on FCAS through the development of emerging technologies can and will become critical elements to the information dominance of other systems in other domains. Gone are the days of the selfish fighter jet. FCAS will not just be a consumer in the world of information dominance, it will be a provider and an enabler of information dominance to and for others, a key facet of information dominance. Much of the ability to act in this capacity to achieve on-platform, in-domain information dominance and then to contribute to information dominance off-platform and across domains can and will be further enabled and enhanced by leveraging the space domain. I'll leave you with that, and I thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to perhaps a couple of questions in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight to the questions. And in fact, quite a few that have come through on Slido are to do with concerns about the potential loss of space. So, for example, we have one. Anu says space capabilities are a must-have. Can you foresee the loss of space as an asset to help parties in conflict with so many more players using space as it gets cheaper to launch?
Quick answer because of the time. If anybody has any doubts about this, the European Space Agency does an annual space data survey that was published 2 weeks ago, and if you look on the last page, I think it's page 120, the figures are really, really shocking, because even if we stopped all space launches now, there are extrapolations for space launches cease, space launches go along projected trajectories, then the number of catastrophic, what we call conjunctions, meaning collisions, is really, really frightening. And never forget that each one of those collisions is producing thousands of bits of debris. And 20 years ago, we modeled this with the Kessler effect, a runaway chain reaction. And I used to laugh at this. I think we're now entering the realms of Kessler scenarios and deniability of use of that, potentially as something that we need to be highlighting on the risk register. But again, Paul, you'll know much more about this than me with data.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted to mention, given the time, was if you go and have a look at the Blackett report, Google it, from 2018, it talked about the loss of just PNT, the positioning, navigation and timing, if we didn't have that. And it was £1 billion a day to the UK economy, just because of how embedded primarily that timing signal is, from financial transactions all the way through to traffic lights, emergency services, nuclear safety, and so on. So we saw in the pandemic, queues for toilet paper and sourdough. You can imagine the carnage when you can't get cash out, the traffic system isn't working. And so it's not just the monetary impact, it's the social impact of that as well.
Let me get the perspective from an astronaut, because one of the questions is, just how catastrophic would this be for militaries, let alone civilians? I mean, for civilians as well, you've looked down on Earth. What's your take?
The issue of space debris is one that's always front and foremost in the minds of at least people in mission control. They're monitoring space debris all the time, looking for potential conjunctions. And if you have a crew in a crewed vehicle on orbit, you tend to send them to their lifeboats if you can't move them out of the way in time. And that's very disruptive to on-orbit activities, as well as unsettling and potentially risky. So low Earth orbit, of course, where the space station is, tends to get cleaned out by the outer reaches of the atmosphere eventually. It's not as bad as it is up at 400 or 500 miles, but it's still a problem for everybody.
Let me bring in Anita Burney. What solutions then could come from the commercial space sector for this?
I think a lot of it is around space domain awareness. As I was saying, there simply aren't enough sensors for us to really know what's going on. And even the ones that we track, the error bars are very wide. And so there's always that question that comes up when we're thinking about how to avoid conjunctions. Are we moving closer to danger, or are we moving ourselves away from it? And so what we need for that is actually persistence. We need more persistent observations so that we can properly catalogue patterns of life and behaviour and really understand better what each of the key risky objects is doing. And that's not just in LEO, that's up at GEO as well. So the commercial solution is all around providing more sensors, more know-how, but to key into your point about having this ocean of intelligence and not a lot of knowledge, the key thing is going to be how do we then process that quickly, linking into what I think Marshall was talking about earlier around quantum and the importance of that. It's going to be leveraging all of those things together that are going to get us to what we need to do and what we need to know to maintain the space environment.
Okay, thank you. Another question's come through. What is the UK Space Command's approach to interaction with industry? Would the preference be a single end-to-end supplier or a capability or a collaborative group taking ownership of different areas of the capability?
I think it's about collaboration. Recently I've started to talk to venture capitalists just to see how they horizon scan to try and find for them the silver bullet to invest in, and for us it's the silver bullet which is the answer to our capability problems. And I think we have to be more transparent in terms of what our capability gaps are, rather than setting requirements such that any of the companies in the audience, for example, if I set out a capability gap, they can come forward with potential solutions rather than us trying to define the solution and providing the requirement. So it is about that collaborative side of things. But trying to do that is difficult. Trying to have those industry forums, trying to have classified industry forums is tricky. The US are much better at it than us with the facilities and the clearances that people have, and we're working on it. It's a long-term journey, but it is definitely a team effort.
Can you take this from your point of view, Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely I can. There are parallels here within what we've done at Team Tempest with the UK government in terms of the government allowing industry a little bit of extra flexibility to fail fast, as Dr. Patrick was talking about, and to take maybe a few more risks, but the understanding that those risks may not deliver on the milestones that we were initially planning. So it's about that flexibility within government to work with industry in manners that industry are used to delivering in and excel in. And it is about that risk margin and about that ability to be flexible.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question from Jim Belden. The advantages of dual-use space capabilities make them attractive, but what are the ethical and legal consequences of integrating military capabilities with civilian ones? Professor, what's your take on that?
I think if not an agency perspective, an academic perspective, I think as long as you're very, very clear, it's a little bit like the old program I was involved with collaborations with China. You know, we had very, very clear firewalls about what we would do and what we wouldn't do. I think there needs to be recognition from the academic community that there are certain areas which will not be open. There needs to be recognition from the defence community that there are certain areas where academics may need much, much more persuading in that way. So those are the practical areas that I alluded to. Ethically, I think that is a massive discussion that we don't have enough time for.
No, we've only got 21 seconds. So, Vice Marshal, let me give you the final thoughts on this.
I completely agree. It is about transparency across the way, from the development of capability gaps, requirements, into the actual use. And certainly one of the things that we are working on with the UK Space Agency, as Anu mentioned, is the National Space Operations Centre. Dual use, because we're looking at civil military space, but all of us know exactly what we're doing when we go into that with our eyes wide open. So it is fully about transparency.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We all know we'd like to continue this conversation, but we are under a strict time limit because of the very fact that we will have coaches waiting at 2 and we do need you to eat your lunch. So thank you very much. You can continue these discussions over lunch, of course, and later in the day if you're together. From my point of view, I'd just like to say what a privilege it has been to be able to have the conversations with so many experts in air and space from around the world, and to get to know some of you on the fantastic rooftop bar yesterday. I really appreciate the conversation, the cooperation and the candour, and I really do wish you the very best for the challenges ahead. But do give a great round of applause to the panel. Thank you.